Hi, I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode. To hear the whole conversation, visit the link in our show notes or search for The Bulletin on your favorite podcast platform. For many Americans, this election warned of more on the line than difficulties with the economy and immigration. Instead, for many, the persistent presence of Donald Trump in the halls of political power signaled and continues to signal significant threats to the future of democracy and conservatism as we know them, threatening the American project itself. Tom Nichols over at The Atlantic called this election the moment of truth. The New York Times editorial board called Trump's win America's perilous choice. Clearly, there are a lot of folks worried about not just the next 4 years, but what this election says about who we are and are becoming as a country. Joining me for this conversation are Mike and Russell and CT's own Marvin Olasky, also a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So, Marvin, you've spent your career in journalism, and all this talk about peril. Help me discern between headline hype, what makes a good headline, and reality. Now that all is said and done, do we really have big things to be worried about when it comes to the survival of the American idea?
Good question. On one level, democracy worked. The losing party conceded. We returned to a long tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. On another level, we saw the impact of a lack of democracy. Kamala Harris did not win the nomination democratically, and that hurt her. She was appointed rather than really nominated. Getting basic here, the founders, because they understood our tendencies to lord it over others, did not like democracy by itself. They thought it would lead to mobocracy ruled by crowd psychology, the passions of the moment. They also didn't like monarchy because it could lead to tyranny, and they didn't like aristocracy because it could lead to feudalism. So they created a mixed government featuring a separation of powers. And, now we'll see how this works. They made the president like a constitutional monarch. They created a Senate that they thought would be an aristocracy. That almost seems like a joke these days. They created the House of Representatives as the voice of democracy. And it'll be interesting to see if Republicans rule all three of those bodies. The founders foresaw a time when the executive and the legislative branches might join forces to preserve their own power at the expense of liberty, so they created a Supreme Court that would prevent or at least curtail such grabbing. So we'll see over the next 4 years what happens. And then, of course, they even didn't trust that. I mean, these were very distrustful founders, so they threw a rope around the whole thing. I mean, there's the Supreme Court as a rope around the triangle of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. And the state legislatures are supposed to be a rope around that. And then the press, I like to say, is the last defense here, and that's the rope around the whole thing. And yeah, we'll just have to see how it works out. These are perilous times that require lots of prayer.
Russell, when I hear these words that Marvin has said, I think back to high school history class. I think about what I learned in my high school government class, and I wonder, what do you think the average American understands about these concepts? Does this election say we really don't understand what a democracy actually is, what representative government actually is?
Well, I think that has been the case in at least large segments of the American population for a while. A shout out to my fellow Gen Xers who learned the preamble to the Constitution from an animated cartoon, Schoolhouse Rock, and also learned the shot heard around the world and every bit of civics and an American government that really landed with people of that generation came that way. I kind of nostalgically on Election Day just re-listened to the singing of the preamble, ended it by listening to the singing of interjections from Grammar Rock from that day. But I think there is a lack of understanding deeply of American civics, but I think to some degree that has been more or less true in almost every generation, at least for our lifetime. I think the bigger problem is what Neil Postman warned us about, rather than what others who would say we're losing our understanding of the mechanics of everything, and that is a sense of politics as a source of meaning and drama, and that I think is a much bigger problem right now.
Mike, the Democrats ran their whole campaign on this idea of Donald Trump as a threat to democracy. What did they get wrong?
Well, I think part of what they got wrong was how they underestimated how unhappy the American people were with the rule of the Democrats for the last 4 years. There's already some interesting data that shows that probably the most effective sort of get out the vote effort by the Trump campaign was an ad that was run in the final days of the campaign. They threw a ton of money behind it, and it was an ad in which Kamala Harris is seen, talking about free gender transition care for people in American prisons. And the punchline of the ad was, Donald Trump cares about you, Kamala Harris cares about they, them. And it's a perfect distillation of kind of the general message of the Trump campaign, which is that, Washington is run by this cadre of elite bureaucrats who care about these hyper-progressive causes. Meanwhile, you, the American people, you guys are suffering. You can't afford gas and groceries, and you're continually left behind. I think the big mistake of the Harris campaign, and it was a bind that she was in because she was part of the Biden administration. She could never effectively separate herself from his agenda and legacy. And I think at the same time, she had a certain sense of obligation to kind of the progressive core of her party. And she didn't want to separate herself from that either. There was also reporting today that actually Bill Clinton had gone to the campaign and said, you got to create some space between yourself and all this sort of trans activism, trans women and women's sports, all of this. And the campaign just kind of brushed it all off. So being hitched to Biden, being hitched to the most progressive ideas inside the party, making no effort to distinguish yourself in those ways, I think that was a sort of a poison recipe, among other things that went wrong for the campaign.
Yeah, and I think the trans issue, while not definitive in terms of the election, you're right. That ad spoke to something kind of symbolically. I was talking to one of the leaders of the activism for same-sex marriage throughout the 80s, 90s, and on in, when it was seen to be completely ridiculous. He and I obviously disagree on these issues, but he said to me, he said, politically, what we were trying to do is to persuade the American people that what we were asking for was to be more like everybody else, and that this would be a conserving sort of institution. Now, whether that's true or not is an entirely different debate, but that was the political, rhetorical appeal. And he said what the trans movement is doing is to say we want to undo things as simple as gender binary in a way that seems to most people to be ridiculous, even if they do want to accommodate trans people. That larger message there seems alien, strange, and until you can get to the point where you can actually talk about those things in commonsensical terms, rather than appeasing the activist base, it's going to be a problem in his view. And I certainly see that's the case.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.